It's time for Defending and Commending the Faith with Joe Mott, inviting the atheist, agnostic, and skeptic to examine for themselves the evidence for the Christian faith. We are all limited by what we do not know and by the things we think we know but are not true. Dr. Joe Mott earned his PhD at LSU and was a distinguished math professor at Florida State University for 38 years, helping to write 3 math textbooks and authoring over 30 research articles in math. He is now the host of this radio program, Defending and Commending the Faith. Here is Joe Mott.
Hello to everyone. Welcome to the program. Followers of Christ are still being called into action for defending and commending the Christian faith. In the last few episodes, I have been expressing objections to and answering questions about Darwinian evolution, the great contemporary sacred cow in our culture. Yet, there is a large accumulating body of evidence against Darwin's theory. Our discussions have pointed out some chinks in Darwin's armor. Many people have been taught evolution as an unquestionable fact, while being unaware of the numerous historical errors, frauds, exaggerations, and premature conclusions that have appeared in its defense. My purpose is not simply to expose fraud, but to encourage readers to evaluate evidence very critically. Remember, science is performed by fallible people. A predetermined bias can influence scientific conclusions. Incorrect ideas sometimes remain in textbooks for decades. Scientific consensus does not guarantee the truth. Darwin himself, in his 1859 book, The Origin of Species, by means of natural selection, acknowledged certain problems with his theory. Problems that science is still struggling with today. Darwin took seriously objections to his theory that had been raised by many of the most eminent naturalists of his days, but he expected future discoveries would solve them. In the 1859 publication, The Origin of Species, he considered in detail 37 of them. Darwin acknowledged that there were a crowd of difficulties with his theory and stated some of them are so serious that to this day I can hardly reflect on them without being in some degree staggered. But to the best of my judgment, the greater number are only apparent, and those that are real are not, I think, fatal to the theory. Notice one thing about Darwin's response at the end of the above quotation. Objections to his theory are not fatal. He offers no evidence for that claim. That relegates his response to just an opinion. Here is a basic fact in my mind. Opinions do not solve scientific problems. Darwin's book advocates species evolved through descent with modifications from a common ancestor. Darwin's theory of evolution has been a subject of criticism since its conception. Critics argue that it goes against various philosophical, religious, and scientific principles. Since then, others have come to the same conclusion, that there are problems with the Darwinian theory of evolution. The consequences for man of Darwin's theory were clear. Man was no longer at the center of the living world. The human was not a created being made in the image of God. Neither was the human the product of a divine plan. Evolution does not have a plan. E.J. Larson, author of the 2002 book, The Theory of Evolution, A History of Controversy, writes on page 58 that Darwin did what he could to document his view that natural selection was a plausible mechanism. Not necessarily the best mechanism, but at least a plausible one, because he needed at least some mechanism that was better than Lamarck's theory in order to have people buy into his theory of evolution. His mechanism was natural selection. Darwin could not prove that natural selection of random inborn variations caused evolution. He could and did argue, however, that it could do so. Not that it did do so, but that it could. What was the evidences and arguments for this conclusion? His strongest evidence was artificial selection. Indeed, that is how he starts his book, and he spends much of his time on artificial selection. Of course, artificial selection no more proves evolution than the fact that humans have built computers proves that a computer can evolve slowly by natural means without intelligence. Larson adds on page 83 of his book, The Theory of Evolution, that Darwin eventually realized that there existed major problems with the theory of natural selection. Indeed, these problems were so profound that even Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace increasingly sought other evolutionary mechanisms to supplant natural selection. Wallace was a British naturalist, explorer, geographer, and co-discoverer of evolution by natural selection. Most surprisingly, Darwin retreated back to the discredited theory of evolution due to Lamarck, which postulated that biological characteristics acquired during one's lifetime could be passed on to one's offspring. Darwin was forced to keep revising the original theory in Origin of Species. Larson says, look at the particular edition of Origin of Species to know what it says. Darwin brought out 6 editions over the next 20 or so years after the publication of the original. It is very Darwinian. It is the account of Darwinian evolution that we know today. If you read the last edition, however, you would think you were reading Lamarck. It includes so many of Lamarckian ideas. Darwin changed his own ideas to meet scientific objections. He still remains an evolutionist, but the mechanism changes to his own work. B. Houston, author of 2012 book Natural God, Deism in the Age of Intelligent Design, wrote that for Darwin, even the term evolve itself evolved. In the first edition of The Origin of the Species, published in 1859, Darwin uses only forms of the word descent rather than evolution. Not until the 6th edition, published in 1872, does Darwin use the word evolution. That's found on page 124 of Natural God. Cambridge University professor Peter Vorzimmer wrote in an article entitled Charles Darwin and Blending Inheritance in ISIS, volume 54, 1963, page 371, that the evolutionary writings of Charles Darwin in the latter part of his life, when contrasted with The Origin of Species in 1859, indicate a considerable change in his evolutionary thought over the intervening years. The overall change effected appears great, and the resultant view nearly antithetical to that of the first edition of The Origin. And such a radical change could not be looked upon merely as a modification of an earlier view, but as an adoption of a distinctly new one. In the introduction to a 1971 edition of Darwin's book, the biologist L. Harrison Matthews observes, "The fact of evolution is the backbone of biology, and biology is thus in a peculiar position of being a science founded on an unproved theory. Is it then a science or a faith? Belief in the theory of evolution is thus exactly parallel to belief in special creation. Both are concepts which believers know to be true, but neither, up to the present, had been able to prove." This observation should send up warning flags in your mind that we can anticipate finding flaws in the Darwinian theory. If I consider Darwin's theory as a bridge, then my investigation into Darwin's theory has not just found one weak beam or girder of the bridge. Rather, there are damaged parts throughout. Let me remind you of 4 objections to Darwin's theory that we have discussed in times past. First, spontaneous generation was refuted by the 3 scientists Francesco Redi, John Needham, and Louis Pasteur. Second, the Cambrian explosion refutes Darwin's idea of gradualism. Third, after years of diligent search, no transitional links have been discovered, which implies Darwin's tree of life has no limb and no leaves on it. Fourth, irreducibly complex systems refute some of Darwin's claims. Michael Behe is the American microbiologist who introduced the concept of irreducible complexity in his book, Darwin's Black Box. He argues that some biological systems, like the eye, are irreducibly complex. That is, they consist of multiple interacting parts, all of which are necessary for the system's present function. According to Behe, such systems could not have arisen through the gradual accumulation of small beneficial mutations envisioned by Darwinian evolution, because the system would not function until all the parts were present. For example, all parts of a mousetrap must be present for it to work as a mousetrap. If even one part is missing, it will not work. Behe says other examples abound, including aspects of DNA reduplication, electron transport, telomere synthesis, photosynthesis, transcription regulation, and more. See pages 160 and 187 of Darwin's Black Box. I would say there is no conceivable way to account naturally for their development. Therefore, there must be an intelligent designer. Behe continues, "The conclusion of intelligent design flows naturally from the data itself, not from some sacred book or sectarian beliefs. Inferring that biochemical systems were designed by an intelligent agent is a humdrum process that requires no new principles of logic or science. Life on Earth, at its most fundamental level, in its most crucial components, is the product of intelligent activity. Found on page 183 of Darwin's Black Box. Allow me to close this episode by reminding you, exercise daily. Walk with God.
Thank you for listening to Defending and Commending the Faith with Joe Mott, a production of Wave 94 Radio in Tallahassee, Florida. If you have any questions or comments for Joe, please forward them to Doug Apple at Wave94 at this email address, dougapple@wave94.com. And be sure to join us every Monday evening at 6:45 p.m. on Wave 94 and subscribe through your favorite podcast app. Defending and Commending the Faith with Joe Mott.